An elderly mother visited the grave of her son, who had passed away 20 years ago, just like she had done countless times before. But that day, as she was tending to the grave, she suddenly heard faint groaning sounds coming from beneath the ground. What happened next would leave everyone utterly shocked. "Jasmine, you got something for me today?" Lydia Walker's frail voice broke the late morning stillness as she shuffled toward the creaking front door. The door had seen better days, its paint chipped and peeling like the life Lydia once knew. But the sound of Jasmine's steps on the dirt path outside was enough to stir her from her chair. Jasmine, the town's only postwoman, flashed her usual warm smile, the kind that carried more kindness than words. "Yes, ma'am. Got a letter today," she said, handing Lydia a neatly folded envelope. For a fleeting moment, Lydia's wrinkled face softened into something akin to joy. Her gnarled fingers trembled as they brushed the paper, tracing the familiar scrawl she knew by heart. "Kyson," she whispered, almost to herself, holding the letter close as if it carried the warmth of her son's hands. 2 decades had passed since the war took Kyson, or so they said. A thin telegram marked his end. Killed in action. But Lydia had refused to bury him, not in her heart, not ever. She had demanded an open casket, only to be met with stern, pitying refusals. They said his body was unrecognizable, burned beyond recognition. What they didn't understand was that she didn't need proof of death. She needed proof of life. And when none came, Lydia created her own. The first letter had been the hardest to write, her hand hesitating over the blank page, tears blurring her vision. But once it was done, addressed from the distant front lines of a war that no longer raged, it became her lifeline. Each week she penned words she thought Kyson might say, folding them neatly and sealing them in an envelope. Jasmine would dutifully take the letters, pretending not to notice the tear-streaked cheeks of the woman who handed them over. A few days later, Lydia would find a reply in the mailbox, one she herself had written. "Dear Mama." The letters would always begin. They were short and kind, filled with mundane details of imagined battles and victories, enough to fill the aching void in her heart. Over time, these letters became more than a ritual. They were a conversation, a bond unbroken by time or death. After Jasmine left, Lydia took the letter to her favorite spot, the small table by the window where the sun could warm her as she read. The tiny village of Zalesnaya lay before her, silent and still, save for the occasional crow cawing from a distant tree. Of the 4 remaining homes, hers was the only one with a garden that bloomed, even in this forgotten corner of the world. "Kyson," she murmured again as she opened the letter, her fingers careful not to tear the paper. The words inside were familiar and comforting, yet new, because she had written them. "Dear Mama, I'm still holding on, even when it feels like the world wants to bury me. But don't worry, your strength keeps me going. I think of you every night. The stars remind me of the way you used to hum me to sleep. I love you. Always. Your Kyson." Her lips quivered as she read, her mind filling the room with his presence. In her world, Kyson wasn't a telegram or a memory. He was alive, writing letters from the battlefield. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the cemetery, a small patch of land on the edge of the village. Her knees ached with every step, but she moved with determination, carrying a tin of water and a small trowel. "Good morning, Griffin," she said softly as she approached the grave marked with a modest stone. Griffin's name was etched there, not Kyson's, because Lydia had insisted. In her mind, Kyson had no grave. He had no need for one. She knelt down, her breath shaky but steady, and began pulling weeds from the edges of the stone, "It's been a quiet week," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Jasmine brought me another letter today. He's still strong, Griffin. My boy's still out there." The grave, of course, didn't answer, but it didn't need to. For Lydia, this place wasn't a marker of death, but a sanctuary of hope. She tended the grave as if Griffin had been her son's truest friend, someone Kyson would want her to care for in his absence. The villagers thought she was mad, and perhaps she was. But Lydia didn't care. She had seen what hopelessness did to people in this forgotten village, how it hollowed them out, made them ghosts in their own homes. Her letters, her conversations with Griffin, her garden, they were her defiance against that emptiness. Jasmine stopped by later in the evening, bringing bread and a small jar of pickled cucumbers Vadim had prepared. "You shouldn't be out so much, Lydia," she said gently, glancing at the older woman's reddened knees and dirt-streaked hands. Lydia chuckled softly, brushing off the concern. "Don't you worry about me, Jasmine. I've got Kyson to keep me strong." Jasmine hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing with Lydia was like trying to move the sun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lydia sat by her window, her gaze fixed on the sky. She watched as the first stars appeared, their faint light like the letters that had kept her alive all these years. Lydia woke the next morning with an ache deep in her chest, the kind that years of loss had taught her to ignore. The sun had barely crept over the horizon, casting pale light through her window, but her restlessness had already pulled her from bed. There was work to do, always work, to keep her hands busy, her mind quiet. Today, like every other, she'd make her way to the graveyard. The tin watering can felt heavier than usual in her grasp, but she paid it no mind. The path to the graveyard was a well-worn line through the weeds, winding past the empty shells of abandoned houses. Her knees groaned as she walked, but she pressed on, whispering her familiar greeting under her breath when the grave of Griffin came into view. "You're looking good today, Griffin," she murmured, setting the watering can down beside the neat plot. A small breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, but the quiet remained undisturbed. She knelt with a wince and reached for the small trowel she kept stashed in the corner of the iron fence. The soil was dry, too dry, she noted as she began to loosen it around the base of the flowers. "The drought's worse than they said this year. Guess it's up to me to keep you looking respectable." But then it came. A sound. A soft, muffled groan, so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. Lydia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her first thought was the wind, though it hadn't stirred since she arrived. She stayed still, straining her ears, and the sound came again, a weak guttural moan rising from the ground beneath her feet. "God above," she whispered, dropping the trowel. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the dry earth, trying to find the source. She leaned closer, her heart hammering now, and the sound grew louder, a pleading, desperate noise that sent chills through her aging frame. "Is someone there?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. There was no response, only the low, mournful groaning that sent her scurrying back on her knees. Her mind raced. She wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was beneath the soil. Gathering her courage, Lydia grabbed the small spade from where it had fallen. "Whoever you are, hold on," she muttered, more to herself than the voice beneath. Her movements were frantic, but deliberate, each scoop of dirt sending her pulse higher. Minutes passed, maybe more, she couldn't tell, but then the spade struck something solid, not rock, plastic. She clawed at the dirt with her bare hands now, pulling it away until the shape beneath was clear, a large, crumpled bag. She hesitated for just a moment, then tore at it with desperate fingers. What she saw inside made her gasp so sharply it hurt. A man's face, pale and streaked with grime, lay just beneath the plastic. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted, and for one horrible moment Lydia thought he was dead. But then she saw it. A faint rise and fall of his chest, so shallow it was almost imperceptible. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," she whispered, her voice shaking as badly as her hands. "You're alive." But what could she do? Her frail arms ached from the effort of digging, and the man was too heavy for her to lift on her own. Panic surged as she realized how little time he might have. She stood shakily, looking around the graveyard as though someone might appear to help. "Vadim," she muttered. "I need Vadim." Her legs felt like lead as she hurried back toward the path, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The world seemed to blur around her, the quiet village suddenly feeling vast and desolate. When she reached Vadim's house, she didn't bother knocking, instead calling out as loudly as she could manage. "Vadim! Vadim! Come quick!" The young man appeared at the door, his face a mask of confusion. "Miss Lydia, what's wrong?" "No time to explain," she panted, clutching the doorframe for support. "There's a man at the graveyard. He's alive, but he's buried. Help me." Vadim's brow furrowed, skepticism clear in his expression. But he didn't argue. He grabbed a shovel from beside the door and followed Lydia as she led him back the way she'd come. When they reached the grave, Vadim's eyes widened. The bag was still partially covered in dirt, the man inside motionless but unmistakably alive. "God, Miss Lydia, you weren't joking," Vadim muttered, dropping to his knees and digging with an urgency that matched her earlier efforts. Between the two of them, they managed to pull the man free, his body limp as Vadim lifted him carefully onto the grass. His breathing was shallow, his face gaunt, but there was life in him still. "Who is he?" Vadim asked, his voice low. I don't know," Lydia admitted, staring at the man with a mix of fear and wonder. "But we couldn't just leave him." Vadim nodded grimly, already checking the man's pulse. "We need to get him water, and I'll call someone. He's in bad shape." Lydia watched as Vadim worked, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The graveyard felt different now, as though the air had shifted, heavy with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. By the time Xavier opened his eyes, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the walls of Lydia's small cottage in muted golds and deep shadows. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, and his hands clenched weakly at the tattered blanket Vadim had thrown over him. The room smelled faintly of old wood and chamomile tea, a comforting contrast to the suffocating darkness he had been buried in. "You're awake," Lydia said softly, her voice a mix of relief and wariness. She sat a few feet away, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on him like he might vanish if she looked away. Xavier turned his head slowly, his eyes bloodshot and heavy-lidded. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps debating whether to speak at all. Finally, his voice rasped out, dry and cracked. "Where am I?" "Safe," she replied. "That's what matters. You're safe now." Vadim appeared from the corner, holding a chipped mug of water. He knelt beside Xavier and helped him sit up enough to drink. "Here, take it slow," Vadim said gruffly, his tone practical but not unkind. Xavier drank deeply, coughing slightly as he lowered the cup. His throat burned, and every muscle in his body ached, but the water gave him enough strength to sit back against the wall. His gaze swept the room, finally settling on Lydia again. "Thank you," he murmured. His voice carried more than gratitude. It held a weight, an unspoken story, a burden too heavy for one man to carry. As the hours passed, Xavier spoke in halting fragments, piecing together his story like shards of broken glass. He had been a soldier once, young, strong, and full of ideals that the war had quickly crushed. Like Kyson, he had served on the front lines, facing the kind of horrors that etched themselves into a man's soul. When it was over, Xavier said, his voice thick with bitterness, there was nothing left. No home, no family, just ghosts. Lydia listened, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She had heard stories like his before, broken men who came back from war only to find they didn't belong in the world they'd fought to protect. I tried, Xavier continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. Tried to start over. But it's not that simple. You fall in with the wrong people, and before you know it, there's no way out. Lydia's chest tightened at his words, a mixture of pity and unease stirring within her. And the grave? She asked cautiously. Xavier exhaled a long, shaky breath. They thought I stole from them. Money, valuables. It didn't matter. They wanted to make an example of me. I don't even remember how they got me out there, just waking up under the dirt, thinking that was it. End of the line. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down like the soil that had nearly claimed him. Lydia's eyes flicked to Vadim, who stood near the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His skepticism was clear, but he said nothing. Why were you at the graveyard? Lydia asked after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier shook his head slowly. I don't know. Guess it was just where they decided to dump me. Lucky for me, you were there. His gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, a faint flicker of something softened his expression. It was later, when the room had grown darker and the faint hum of crickets filled the air, that Xavier noticed the photograph. It sat on a shelf near the window, the light from the oil lamp catching the glass frame. He squinted, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. Who's that? He asked, pointing to the picture. Lydia hesitated, her hands tightening around the edge of her chair. That's Kyson, she said softly. My son. Xavier's brows furrowed, and he stared at the photograph for a long moment. The face in the picture stirred something deep in his memory. A name, a voice, a laugh that seemed to echo faintly through the years. I know him, Xavier said finally, his voice tinged with disbelief. We served together. Kyson Samoylov. Lydia's heart stopped for a beat, her breath catching in her throat. You knew him? Are you sure? Xavier nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the photo. He wasn't just some name to me. He was a friend, a good man. And he... Lydia's voice cracked, unable to finish the question. Xavier turned to her, his expression somber but certain. He didn't die. Not on the battlefield anyway. He was injured, bad, but they got him to a hospital. After that, I don't know. We were separated. The room seemed to tilt around Lydia, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. For years she had clung to the hope that Kyson was still alive, and now here it was, proof, a spark of light in the darkness. By the next morning, Xavier had made up his mind. He stood in the doorway, his frame still weak but steadier than the night before. Lydia watched him with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension as he adjusted the strap of the old satchel Vadim had given him. I owe you my life, Xavier said, his voice firm. And I'll repay it. I'll find Kyson, wherever he is, I promise. You don't have to do this, Lydia replied, her hands clutching the edges of her shawl. Yes, I do, Xavier said simply. His gaze softened as he looked at her. He's out there. I know it. And if I can bring him back to you, maybe I can set something right. Lydia nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of him leaving. Be careful, she said, her voice trembling. Xavier offered a faint smile before stepping out into the early morning light. As he disappeared down the dirt path, Lydia stood in the doorway, the photograph of Kyson clutched tightly in her hands. The road stretched before Xavier like a thread unraveling from an old tapestry, frayed, uncertain, leading him into the unknown. The satchel on his back felt heavier than it should have, though it carried little more than a change of clothes, a flask of water, and the photograph Lydia had pressed into his hands. His steps were slow at first, burdened by thoughts of the past and the promise he'd made. But with each mile, a sense of purpose steadied his pace. If Kyson was out there, Xavier would find him. He owed Lydia that much. He owed himself that much, too. Griffin's name had been the first solid clue. The man had been more than a comrade to Kyson. He'd been a brother in arms, someone who could have been part of the missing pieces in Kyson's story. Xavier followed the name to a small town just outside the old front lines, where he found Griffin's sister living in a crumbling tenement. Griffin's been gone for years, she said, her voice quiet, edged with sorrow. Her eyes, dark and weary, searched Xavier's face as though trying to place him. He disappeared during the war. We never got a body, just a notice that he was missing in action. Xavier nodded, his jaw tightening. He understood the kind of pain that came with a notice like that, an emptiness that could never quite be filled. But you said you served with him? She asked, hope flickering briefly in her gaze. I did, Xavier replied. And with another man, Kyson Samoylov. Do you know the name? The woman frowned, shaking her head slowly. No, I'm sorry, but if Griffin knew him, maybe Svetlana would, too. Svetlana? My younger sister, she explained. She was a nurse during the war, stationed at the field hospital, where they sent most of the wounded. She's the only one who might remember. She scribbled down an address on a scrap of paper, her hand trembling slightly as she passed it to him. Good luck, she said, her tone heavy with years of unspoken grief. And if you find anything about Griffin, I'll let you know, Xavier promised, tucking the paper into his pocket. The hospital was gone, reduced to little more than rubble and overgrown weeds. But Svetlana was still working, now in a small clinic on the edge of another war-torn town. It took Xavier days to reach her, the miles wearing him down until he looked more like a ghost than a man. When he finally stood before her, Svetlana's sharp eyes took him in with a mixture of caution and curiosity. You look like you've been through hell, she said bluntly, folding her arms across her chest. Maybe I have, Xavier replied, his voice hoarse. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it out to her. Do you recognize him? Svetlana's expression softened as she took the picture, studying it intently. Kyson, she murmured, almost to herself. Yes, I remember him. He came through the hospital after an attack. He was in bad shape, concussion, broken ribs, half-starved. But he was alive. Xavier's breath caught in his throat. What happened to him? Svetlana hesitated, her fingers brushing the edges of the photo. He couldn't remember his own name, she said quietly. Whatever happened to him out there, it took his memory. We called him Oliver because, well, he needed a name. And after the hospital? Xavier pressed, his voice tight. He said he wanted to stay, she replied. To work on a farm nearby, start fresh. I thought it was strange at the time. Most of the men wanted to go home, but not him. He seemed lost. She handed the photograph back, her expression somber. I haven't seen him since. That was years ago. The search dragged on. Xavier moved from village to village, following faint whispers and half-remembered stories, but each lead ended the same way, with nothing. The days blurred together, his hope waning as exhaustion set in. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the distant hills, Xavier found himself on the side of a quiet dirt road, his feet aching and his spirit heavier than ever. He stuck out his thumb as a truck approached, its headlights cutting through the dim twilight. The vehicle slowed, the engine rumbling as it came to a stop beside him. Xavier climbed into the passenger seat, muttering a quick word of thanks before settling back against the worn leather seat. You headed far? The driver asked, his voice rough but not unfriendly. Just wherever you can take me, Xavier replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The driver nodded, the truck lurching forward as they continued down the road. For a while, neither man spoke, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. But something about the driver's profile tugged at Xavier's memory, a faint, nagging familiarity he couldn't quite place. He studied the man out of the corner of his eye, his breath catching as recognition slowly dawned. It was the eyes, the shape of the jaw, the scar just beneath his temple. Kyson? Xavier's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that filled the cab. The man glanced at him, his brow furrowing. What did you call me? Xavier swallowed hard, his heart pounding. Kyson, it's you, isn't it? The driver shook his head, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. I think you've got me mixed up with someone else. My name's Oliver. Xavier's chest tightened, the name hitting him like a blow. No, he said firmly. You're Kyson. You don't remember me, but we served together. I know it's you. The man, Oliver, looked at him again, his eyes searching Xavier's face. For a moment there was something there, a flicker of something buried deep. But then it was gone, replaced by a guarded wariness. I don't know what you're talking about, Oliver said, his voice hardening. Xavier sat back, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know how, but he would make Kyson remember. For Lydia, for both of them. The truck rattled along the uneven road, the tires kicking up small clouds of dust in the fading light. Xavier sat silently, his gaze flickering between the passing landscape and Oliver, who gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The name Kyson lingered in the air between them, unspoken now, but heavy. Xavier's mind raced with memories, trying to piece together the fragments that might lead Oliver back to the man he once was. You're quiet, Oliver muttered, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Xavier leaned back, exhaling slowly. Just thinking. About what? Xavier hesitated, choosing his words carefully. About what it means to have a home, a place you belong. Oliver didn't respond, but Xavier caught the slight tightening of his jaw. There was something there, beneath the surface, something he could work with. Hours later, they stopped at a small roadside inn, a nondescript building with peeling paint and a rusted sign that creaked in the wind. The silence between them stretched as they settled into the cramped room, its single bed and lumpy sofa leaving little space for comfort. Why do you care so much? Oliver asked suddenly, breaking the quiet as Xavier sat on the edge of the sofa. Xavier looked up, meeting Oliver's guarded eyes. Because someone's waiting for you. Someone who's held on to hope for 20 years, That kind of love deserves an answer. Oliver scoffed, shaking his head. You've got the wrong man. I'm not whoever you think I am. Xavier's gaze didn't waver. You don't remember, but I do. And when we get to the village, you will too. Oliver didn't reply, turning away and lying back on the bed. The conversation ended there, but Xavier could see the doubt beginning to creep into his expression. The village came into view just as the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky. Xavier pointed out the small dirt path that led toward Lydia's cottage, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. That's it, he said. That's where she's waiting. Oliver hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. I still don't see why this matters. It will, Xavier replied simply. When you see her, it will. As the truck rolled to a stop in front of the cottage, the door creaked open, and Lydia stepped out onto the porch. She froze when she saw them, her frail hands clutching the edge of her shawl. Xavier saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes the moment she saw not Oliver, but Kyson. Kyson, she whispered, her voice trembling. Oliver shifted uncomfortably, looking to Xavier for guidance. But Xavier only nodded toward Lydia. Go to her. Reluctantly, Oliver stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the porch. Lydia's breath hitched, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she reached out a trembling hand. It's you, she said, her voice breaking. My boy. My Kyson. Oliver stopped short, his expression a mixture of confusion and unease. I don't know you, he said, his voice low. Lydia didn't falter. She stepped closer, her hand lightly brushing his arm. You might not remember, but I do. I've waited so long for this moment. For a long moment, Oliver stood frozen, unsure of what to say. But something in Lydia's voice, in the way her eyes looked at him with such unshakable love, stirred something deep within him. Inside the cottage, Lydia poured tea with trembling hands, her gaze never straying far from Oliver, who sat stiffly at the table. Xavier leaned against the wall, watching the two of them carefully. I'm sorry, Oliver said suddenly, breaking the silence. I don't know what you expect from me. Lydia smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't expect anything, Kyson. Just having you here is enough. Xavier stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. She doesn't need you to remember everything right away, but maybe if you listen, it'll come back to you. Over the next few hours, Xavier shared stories of the war, moments they had shared on the battlefield, the camaraderie that had held them together in the darkest of times. Lydia spoke too, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words, recounting Kyson's childhood, the little things that had made him who he was. Oliver listened, his brows furrowed, his hands fidgeting on the table. The memories didn't come easily, but there were flashes, small fleeting moments that felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. I remember a song, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone used to sing it, at night when it was quiet. Lydia's hand flew to her mouth, a soft sob escaping her lips. I used to sing to you, she said, her voice shaking. Every night when you were a boy. Oliver's eyes met hers, and for the first time, something softened in his expression. The days that followed were quiet but full of a tentative hope. Oliver didn't yet call himself Kyson, but he stayed. He helped Lydia in the garden, listened to more of her stories, and slowly began to settle into the rhythm of life in the village. Xavier, true to his word, stayed as well. He worked on fixing up one of the empty cottages, his presence a steady reassurance for both Lydia and Oliver. The mornings in the village were crisp and quiet, the kind of silence that carried a sense of calm rather than emptiness. Oliver, still hesitant to claim the name Kyson, rose early each day, drawn to the routines that had become a part of him since his arrival. The days felt fuller than they had in years, though he couldn't explain why. He started in the garden, tending to the rows of vegetables Lydia had carefully planted. The work was simple, but satisfying, his hands moving through the soil with surprising familiarity. Lydia would join him, her frail frame wrapped in a shawl, and together they'd talk about everything and nothing at all. "You've got a knack for this," Lydia said one morning, watching as Oliver carefully staked a drooping tomato plant. "Maybe," he replied, his voice soft. He looked up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Feels right, somehow." Lydia's eyes glistened, but she didn't push him. She'd learned to let the memories come on their own, like seeds that needed time to sprout. Xavier, meanwhile, had thrown himself into fixing up one of the abandoned cottages at the edge of the village. The place was in rough shape, roof sagging, windows broken, and walls leaning like they'd given up the fight against time. "Could have picked an easier project," Oliver commented one afternoon, leaning against the fence as he watched Xavier wrestle with a rusted hinge. "Where's the fun in that?" Xavier grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. In truth, the work wasn't just about building a house. It was about rebuilding himself, piece by piece, plank by plank. Every nail he drove into the wood felt like a step toward redemption, a way to prove to himself, and maybe to Lydia, that he wasn't the man he used to be. The villagers had started to notice. Xavier's quiet determination, his willingness to help without asking for anything in return, had begun to shift their initial wariness into cautious respect. "You're doing good here," Vadim said one evening, handing Xavier a cold beer as they sat on the cottage's front steps. Xavier shrugged, taking a long sip. "Still got a lot to make up for." Vadim nodded, not pressing further. In this village, they all carried their own ghosts. It was during one of these evenings that Xavier brought up the grave. He and Lydia were sitting on her porch, the sun dipping low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the garden. "You've been tending that grave for a long time," Xavier said, his voice careful. Lydia looked at him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's Griffin's," she said simply. "You ever wonder if it really is?" Xavier asked, his tone gentle but persistent. Lydia hesitated. She'd spent 20 years convincing herself that the grave wasn't Kyson's, but Griffin's. It was easier that way, less painful. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying maybe it's time we knew for sure." It took weeks to make the arrangements, but eventually they stood at the edge of the graveyard, the air heavy with anticipation. A team from the city had come to assist with the exhumation, their faces solemn as they worked. Lydia clutched Oliver's arm tightly, her fingers trembling. He stood beside her, his expression unreadable but his presence steady. Xavier watched from a few steps away, his jaw clenched as the truth they'd been avoiding for so long was slowly unearthed. When the remains were finally revealed, there was no denying it. The DNA tests confirmed what Xavier had suspected. The grave truly belonged to Griffin. Lydia's knees buckled, and Oliver caught her before she could fall. Tears streamed down her face, not of grief, but of release. "All this time," she murmured. I thought I was just trying to hold on to Kyson, but I was keeping Griffin alive too. The revelation brought a strange sense of peace to the village. Griffin's family, informed of the findings, visited the grave for the first time in decades. His sisters, including Svetlana, knelt beside the headstone, their hands brushing the soil as they whispered their goodbyes. For Xavier, it was another weight lifted from his shoulders. Griffin had been more than a comrade. He'd been a friend. Knowing that his final resting place was known, that his name would be remembered, brought a measure of closure that had eluded him for years. Life in the village settled into a steady rhythm after that. Oliver continued his work in the garden, the lines of his face softening as he began to let himself feel at home. Lydia, buoyed by the newfound clarity, seemed lighter, her steps more assured. Xavier finished the cottage, its once crumbling walls now sturdy and warm. He moved in quietly, the space sparse but welcoming. He often found himself on Lydia's porch in the evenings, sharing stories and quiet moments with her and Oliver. One night, as the three of them sat under the stars, Lydia reached over and took Oliver's hand. "You've given me more than I could have ever asked for," she said, her voice steady. Oliver looked at her, his eyes searching. "I still don't remember everything," he admitted. "You will," Lydia replied, her smile soft. "And even if you don't, you're here. That's enough." Xavier raised his glass, his voice quiet but firm. "To Griffin, and to finding our way back." Kyson worked in silence most mornings, his hands calloused from days spent repairing fences, mending roofs, or digging in the garden. He still didn't call himself Kyson, not yet, but he'd stopped flinching when Lydia used the name. Something about the rhythm of life in the village was grounding, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't known he'd been missing. At first, the villagers had eyed him with curiosity, their whispers following him as he walked down the dirt paths or stopped by the well to draw water. But his quiet determination, the way he never turned down a task, and his gentle manner with Lydia had gradually won them over. One day, Vadim called out to him from the edge of the field. "Hey, Kyson, got a minute?" Kyson wiped the sweat from his brow and approached, his brow furrowed in mild confusion. "What do you need?" Vadim held up a rusty hoe. "Reckon you're the kind of guy who knows how to fix things. Think you can work some magic on this old thing?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of Kyson's mouth. "I'll see what I can do." By the end of the week, Vadim's hoe was as good as new, and the whispers of the village had shifted from curiosity to quiet admiration. Xavier, meanwhile, had taken on a project of his own. He spent hours hauling wood, repairing beams and replacing shattered windows in the old schoolhouse. It had been years since children had played in the village, but Xavier said the building deserved to stand proud, even if only for the memories it held. The work was hard, but it gave Xavier a focus, a way to channel the restlessness that sometimes crept in when the nights grew quiet. He couldn't undo the choices he'd made in his past, the lives he'd hurt. But here, in this village, he could do something good. "Why the schoolhouse?" Lydia asked one evening as they sat together on the porch. Xavier shrugged, his hands rough and splintered from the day's labor. "Feels right," he said simply. "Building something up instead of tearing it down for once." Lydia nodded, her gaze softening. "You've been good for this place, Xavier. For all of us." His jaw tightened, a flicker of doubt passing over his face. "I'm just trying to make up for things. Don't know if I ever can, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Lydia reached over, resting her hand lightly on his. "You're doing more than enough." As the days turned into weeks, Kyson and Lydia began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost normal. He didn't remember their past, not fully, but there were moments, small, fleeting glimpses, that stirred something in him. One afternoon, Lydia was humming softly as she prepared lunch, her hands deftly slicing vegetables from the garden. Kyson paused in the doorway, the melody catching his ear. "I know that song," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but certain. Lydia turned, her eyes wide. "You do?" Kyson nodded slowly. "I don't know how, but I do." A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek, though she quickly brushed it away. "I used to sing it to you when you were a boy, to help you sleep." The word settled over Kyson like a warm blanket, filling a space inside him he hadn't realized was empty. He didn't say anything more, but later that evening, when Lydia hummed the tune again, he found himself joining in, the notes coming naturally to his lips. One evening, Xavier returned from the nearby town carrying a small, worn envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. It showed Kyson and Griffin standing side by side in their uniforms, their faces young and determined. "I thought you might want to see this," Xavier said, handing the photo to Kyson. Kyson stared at the image, his fingers tracing the lines of his own face. "That's me," he said, almost in disbelief. "And that's Griffin," Xavier added. "He was a good man. You two were like brothers." For a moment the room was silent, the weight of the past settling heavily around them. Then Kyson looked up, his expression pained but resolute. "I want to remember," he said quietly. "I need to remember." The photo seemed to unlock something in Kyson. He began asking more questions, piecing together fragments of his life from Xavier's stories and Lydia's gentle guidance. One night, as the three of them sat by the fire, Kyson turned to Lydia, his voice hesitant. "Did I have a dog?" Lydia's face lit up, a mixture of surprise and joy. "You did. A scrappy little thing named Rufus. You found him on the edge of the woods and brought him home, like he was a treasure." Kyson smiled faintly, the memory fuzzy but there, like a long-lost thread finally weaving back into place. The changes in Kyson weren't lost on the villagers. He'd begun to call himself by his old name, and there was a lightness to his step, a confidence in his movements that hadn't been there before. "You're looking more like yourself every day," Vadim remarked one morning, as they worked side by side repairing the church roof. Xavier glanced at him, a small smile playing on his lips. "Feels that way," he admitted. For Xavier, seeing Xavier begin to reclaim his identity was a bittersweet victory. He'd come to the village searching for redemption, but he'd found something more. A family. A place to belong. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Xavier stood beside Lydia on the porch, watching Kyson work in the garden. "He's coming back to us," Lydia said softly, her voice filled with quiet hope. Xavier nodded, his gaze steady. "And I think I am too." The village had been a place of loss and sorrow for so long, but now, with Kyson and Xavier there, it felt alive again. It wasn't just the buildings they were fixing, it was each other. The story is a deeply moving exploration of resilience, love, and redemption. Each character embarks on a transformative journey, but Kyson's path is particularly poignant. His struggle to reclaim his identity after years of amnesia mirrors the universal human desire to belong and find meaning. Lydia's unwavering hope and Xavier's pursuit of redemption provide the emotional backbone of the narrative, showcasing the strength of the human spirit even in the face of unimaginable loss and guilt. The story teaches us profound lessons about forgiveness, the enduring power of hope, and the importance of human connection. It reminds us that family is not just about shared blood, but shared moments, care, and understanding. By helping each other heal, the characters rebuild not only their lives, but the heart of a forgotten village, leaving a powerful message. Love and perseverance can triumph over the deepest wounds of time and war. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.